Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." Mark chapter 4. Sorry, I've got coffee with me. Is a chapter, and beginning in verse 1, Jesus is teaching in a boat because there's so many people around him. And that's what we see in verse 1. And then Mark will use this whole this whole chapter to talk about parables. Explain that Jesus taught in parables and that later he would come back to the disciples and explain them. So what we gather is this happens that day. In this day of teaching of parables from a boat, likely in the city of Capernaum. That's where that was a city on the Sea of Galilee, and one that Jesus did a lot of his ministry from. It's where Peter and Andrew and James and John had their fishing business, and so probably from there, that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." So when evening came, which just means late in the day, right? Late in the day, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." So kind of the idea here is with our last remaining daylight, let's get over to the other side. They're probably going to boat through the night. Now, they are on the Sea of Galilee. The lake is shaped roughly something like that. It's about 7 miles from this side to this side. And it's about 14 from top to bottom. And so they were in Capernaum, which is kind of over here. And the other side is over here. And it's interestingly enough, it's Gentile. So this side of the lake was Hebrew, and this side of the lake was Greek. And this area is called the Decapolis. So Jesus is with his disciples. They're now in the evening going to row across the boat several miles to the other side. Leaving the crowd, all right, so he said to the disciples, "Let us go over to the other side," right? So a simple enough mission. In fact, it would seem that other boats who were there in Capernaum, there were also other boats with him. That is, there were other boats making this trek across the lake this way. So it could have just been people who were doing trade in the Decapolis and came over to Capernaum to sell their goods, or maybe Greek or Jewish people who lived in the Decapolis but came over to Capernaum to hear Jesus teach. Whatever the case may be, that's the situation we're in. So he says to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And so we have a simple instruction, and this is really kind of our intro. It's our intro, and it's the setting, right, for what's about to happen here. The next point, leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. It's interesting that this detail is added, just as he was. There's nothing in Scripture that is there without intention. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the intention of Mark's word about just as he was in the boat? That just means that they're not taking along days of supplies for their stuff. They're just going. Like, this is an unplanned trip across the lake. They leave the crowd behind. They take him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. So we get some additional details in this. And then the action begins to pick up right here in verse 7. And really, it's the introduction of a problem. And the problem is a big old storm. A furious squall came up, and waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. These boats, roughly 20 to maybe 25 feet long, and with pretty short sides. So it wouldn't take big waves to crash over the boat. But again, this is just a lake. It's only 7 miles across and 14 miles up north to south. So how big can the waves get? Well, it turns out that geographically, the Sea of Galilee is in a unique place. And these furious squalls actually do come up in this area, and they can be rather intense. In any case, though, because they only needed relatively short waves, we shouldn't think of these like 20-foot tall waves, but it wouldn't take much to sink a small boat, a small fishing boat here in this lake. The waves are breaking over the boat, and the boat's beginning to fill with water, and it was nearly swamped. And so that feeling, that sinking feeling, right, where your boat starts slowing down because it's taking on so much water, and at a certain point, very quickly, the boat will be completely swamped, right, as it begins to fill with water. And while this is going on, Jesus was in the stern. And so if this is your boat right here, you got your cool sail. The stern is the backside, the rear of the boat. And the kind of the assumption here is that Jesus is not sleeping down here in the bottom, but rather that Jesus is sleeping perhaps on like a raised area on the stern. As we've seen, you can kind of see some models of boats have a raised bed area back there, and other ones don't. Other ones are just empty. It's just boat, right? So there's no place to sit or anything like that. In which case, if Jesus is sleeping, he's sleeping down here. No matter the case, as waves are coming all over this, Jesus is sleeping on a cushion. He's got to be soaking wet, but just doesn't care. He's not worried about the storm. He's not worried about the waves. He's just like, man, we had a long day. I want to get some sleep in. So Jesus in the stern, he's sleeping on a cushion. And this is something that we really want to pay attention to in this story. We could ask ourselves a question, what is Jesus doing? What is Jesus doing? And what do I learn from that? Right? And so we're gonna explore that in the verses ahead. But for the first part, in the middle of a furious squall, so that the boat is nearly swamped, Jesus is sleeping. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Jesus is sleeping, and so often we interpret, like the disciples kind of picture us right now, so often we interpret God, who doesn't act, he sleeps, it would seem, in the midst of our lives falling apart. Our boat is nearly swamped. Jesus is sleeping. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" All right, and then we see the disciples show up right there. This is the heart of the disciples. They are interpreting, right? This is an interpretation of sleep. Jesus is sleeping, and they see that as, don't you care? They see that as, Jesus doesn't care about us. Jesus doesn't care what happens. Don't you care if we drown? Don't you love us, Jesus? Why are you just sleeping? So there's the problem, and again, we're going to kind of pay attention to their actions and kind of learn what we're supposed to learn in this. So Jesus gets up, right? He rebukes the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." So we got two actions. He gets up. Whoopsie, not the wrong color. He gets up, rebukes. Those are the two. He wakes, he gets up from his sleep. So he didn't just keep sleeping. And then secondly, he rebukes the wind and waves and says, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm, right? So Jesus' words, he said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still," directly relates to these actions. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. So, what is Jesus doing? Well, number one, he's sleeping, but then he rouses himself. He rebukes the wind and the waves. And And the wind goes away, and the waves disappear. And says a lot to us. It teaches us a great deal about Jesus's power, his authority, right? So what do I learn from this? I learned that Jesus is God, right? He can do what only God can do. He can rebuke wind and waves, and they obey him. It was completely calm. He says, quiet, be still, and they're calm. Like, I wish you could do that with your kids sometimes. Just stop yelling. Anyways. Then Jesus teaches. He has a lesson for the disciples, and if we learn that lesson well, we'll learn what we're supposed to learn. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" This fear is what he was talking about up here with, "Don't you care if we drown?" Why are you so afraid? He says to his disciples. So he speaks, he teaches, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Which means that there is a relationship between faith and fear. These are related. We could say of Jesus, Jesus, why aren't you afraid? Jesus, why are you not afraid in the boat? And the answer is because that Jesus has faith. Faith in what, right? Jesus knows where he is going to die. He is going to die on a cross. Which means there's no way that this boat and this storm are going to take him out. He's very much like Paul, as Paul was sailing to Rome. When Paul was told, you're going to go appeal before Caesar, he's not afraid of a poisonous snake. It can't kill him. Jesus knows that this storm cannot kill him. The boat nearly swamps, and if what it would take for God to save the disciples is to bring another boat nearby, if what it would take for God to save the disciples is for the storm to immediately stop or whatever, God's going to do it. But the disciples don't need to fear. They don't need to rouse themselves. God's got this under control because this is not the place where Jesus is going to die. Jesus is going to die on the cross. He's going to die on a cross. So when he says, do you still have no faith? The idea is here, do you really think God's going to let us die here on this lake? No, we've got work to do. We've got a mission here. I've got a mission here. So don't be afraid. Don't be afraid that things are outside of God's control. Jesus teaches, right? So we could learn from this, and this is kind of how I've always taken this. If Jesus is sleeping, if I am in the midst of what feels like an overwhelming swamp of life, and God is relaxed, God doesn't seem to be acting, God doesn't seem to be disturbed by the situation, then I should sleep too. So if in the middle of the storm, Jesus can sleep, the lesson for me is that in faith, I can have peace. I should be able to sleep in the middle of the storm as long as my faith is in the Lord. What's funny is that the disciples, they are even more scared, not of the waves, but of this person they're in the boat with, right? They ask, who is this that even the wind and waves obey him? They have a new fear now, and it's Jesus. They're like, he just told the wind and waves, hey, knock it off. Be quiet, be still. And they were stilled, and that terrified them. There's another lesson for us in this. Fear of God frees us from other lesser fears. Storms are real crazy until, God speaks and then they're done. And so this last piece is the disciples. The disciples learn. And here they learn primarily this, that Jesus is God. But secondly, hopefully, they'll learn this other part, that I can have peace by trusting in God, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. And so what's important to remember is always that, we're never alone in the boat. Jesus is always with us. And that if he's not acting miraculously to save us, right, we don't have to be afraid. We're not going to die unless it's time to go home. And then there's nothing we can do to avoid it, right? So in either case, there is this sleep for us, rest for us, even in the midst of difficult circumstances and even in the midst of trials and even in the midst of life-threatening ones. There is still sleep for those who have faith in God.